Okay, we're beginning week 3, lesson 3, graphic and photographic elements. We're going to think about this as getting back to the basics, and we learn about shapes, circles, triangles in elementary school. And those are very significant structures to the photographer, and you want to pay attention to those as you compose your images. Also, be aware of the idea of an implied line. What is an implied line? And we can think about that as the joining of two tones, shapes, contrast, and that edge where they meet is an implied line, and implied lines really help in an image. In this particular photograph, we have what we refer to in photo 114 as an implied or an internal framing. There's another frame that frames something within the image. And in 114, you're taught that this is a good element to have. Sometimes we see that as branches or trees that encroach upon the image from the sides. And it is a good technique, but you are going to go far beyond that, especially once you get into the latter part of this class when we look at the artistic image. In the beginning, you'll see that it is kind of an elementary way to frame or compose a photograph, and later on we're going to have much more sophisticated methods in a way to direct the viewer's eyes. Using basic shapes as the underlying composition. The text in these PowerPoints are hoping to reinforce the ideas of what they're describing. So right now we see a square, and as you follow the words around, you understand that this indeed is a square. We have an ellipse, referred to sometimes as an oval. What happens in that, and why are we looking at it? Well, if we look at this image, we go backwards, we see this ellipse, and we can kind of superimpose that in this particular photograph and see that that underlying structure inherent in this photograph is an ellipse that helps unify and control the content of the frame. If you place something in the center, our eyes don't always have that interest to peruse the remainder of the image. So it's really important, if you're going to put something dead center, that there is a really good reason for placing that in the dead center. At this point, you're learning that there are natural zones for placing objects or points or ideas of interest, and you want to be particularly aware of what that does for the viewer. So some of the natural placements for a dominant point can be central, it can be close to the edge, it can be slightly off center. Now remember, these are really kind of concrete rules in the beginning, and as you move towards the latter half of this quarter or the semester, you will learn that you can break these rules, but you have to understand them initially. This particular photograph, we're drawn directly to the center. We just talked about that internal framing where that branch helps to also create another frame within a frame. Use the describe method again. Write down a few notes as I'm speaking about what you see in this image. Describe it. And once you do that, kind of think about now, what do these elements put together do to you as a viewer? What do you feel? And some people will comment on this particular photograph by Harry Callahan that it is really drab, it's really dreary, it's very static, and it is emotionally stunting for the viewer. It's depressing. Does this mean that this is a bad image? You get to decide. Again, placements for dominant points within an image. These are some of the places. As soon as other points within the photograph are introduced, you start to get a much more complex image, and that the simplicity or the minimalist style is lost. And we'll talk about that about week 6 or 7 about minimalism. In looking at this photograph, we're talking about individual points. Where are the points? What is it we're supposed to look at? And I kind of say that there are several points within this photograph. Okay? We're not really quite sure what the photographer wants us to identify with or wants us to see. This can be described as a dominant point because it's red, it stands out, it's in contrast to the rest of the organic material inherent in the image. But there are many points that happen within this photograph. Looking at them, are they random? Are they planned? And the camera angle will actually alter those points in the image depending on the perspective and how you, the photographer, contain those points in the image. Lines. We learned in 114 about leading lines. Is that always important to have? This path that's created with the lines leading us back into the perspective and to the center are what we refer to as leading lines. We have a horizon line, which is dead center, which oftentimes we say that we don't want to do because it makes the image static. But you can see in this image that the horizon line being placed dead center actually works. These vertical lines also help us trail off into the distance where the photographer wants us to see. And while it's a very symmetrical image, it is still constructed in such a way that it holds our interest. We're not just confined to the dead center and forgetting about the information on the opposite sides. Horizontal lines and vertical lines together can be very complementary. I want you to understand that horizontal lines are typically more placid and more calming than vertical lines, which tend to be a little more chaotic. We read them a little faster. There's a different energy with an image that has many vertical lines. Okay, we look at this very quickly, we go in, we go out, but then we come back and say, well, what's going on in this area? And it holds our interest a little bit longer because we want to peek through that fence to see what's happening. So, though it's very static, it does control us to come back and take a look further. Diagonal lines reinforce the movement within an image. Diagonal lines reinforce movement within an image. And while this is not particularly a technically well-exposed image, we do have all these zigzag lines and these dynamic lines that keep us moving. Negative space to the positive space, and that helps balance out the image. Vectors are kind of a confusing idea and way to look at images. So don't get trapped up in what a vector is or what it isn't, but be aware that it is the way that the eye moves within an image. It directs the eyes, very similar to rhythm. And in this initial stage of your photographic understanding through aesthetics and composition, a lot of these ideas will overlap, and you can't just call one image, this is all about lines, or this is all about vertical lines, or this is rhythm, and this is vectors. Allow them to overlap, because they will, and they should be aware of that. They are important because it controls the way in which we read the image and the way in which we understand the photograph. We'll say that this image has vectors. So as you look at it, where are those vectors? Where is the movement? How are your eyes reading this? Is it between the hairs that are side lit? Is it between around the side of the face? Where are those vectors occurring? Where are the vectors in this image? Where is this much more rhythmic? What's happening in this particular photograph? How is the photographer controlling us to look through this? Is it okay to chop the subject's head off? We're going to get to intent of an image and what an image has to do to answer that question. Are there vectors in here? Is there rhythm that occurs with this image as we read it? Are the vectors between the trees that we read back and forth? Is there rhythm in the way in which we read this particular photograph by following the contours of the windows? Curves are interesting in that they are immediately involving the viewer. They are inherently attractive to the viewer. They have to be controlled. You have to be aware of what that curve is doing. So as you're composing without the camera, be aware of where the curves occur, and then be very specific and very attuned as you look through the viewfinder or your live view on the back of the camera in curving, controlling and composing the curves. Very elegant and rhythmic image, very organic in its feel. The curves lead us in and throughout. There are implied lines through that curve, the contrast of the water, the more still blue water to the warmer water above. So that curve makes this a very calming image. Black and white, we're very much drawn to that curve of the step, the curve of the rail, especially when the element of color is removed from the image. Then when color is removed from an image, period, the image must really have something that drives the photograph. Again, a curve, very bold, very strong photograph in terms of the presentation of the subject, but very calming in terms of the color and the curves that take us back down. Eye lines, there's a couple ways to think about eye lines here. They are examples of the Gestalt lines of good continuation. So if we're looking at this diagram, we're looking at it and saying that these eyes are looking over into our left shoulder. So it's natural for us to follow an image that has eye lines that control us to look where the image is looking. Where does that eye line occur? In this particular photograph, the eye line is very much directed directly to the viewer. We are engaged with the subject, looking directly into her eyes, and so we're immediately have an involvement with the photograph because of that eye line. So it's a direct eye contact between the subject and the photographer. Understand these particular points. I'm sure that you've taken notes along the way. Keep those notes together because they'll come in handy as we get towards the end of the quarter if your instructor has chosen for you to do the assignment that asks to write a paper. But it will also help with the assessment component of this. And again, if you can take an image apart, you can put an image together. So understanding all these things and having those notes available to you will help you. For assignment 3, this says shoot a group, a set, a combination, a collection, a gaggle, a bunch, a lot of things or objects. Now that doesn't mean that you have to go out and do each one of those. These are just suggestions. Remember again that we don't want you to use Flash until the end of the quarter when you get to the documentary and perhaps when you get into the artistic phase of shooting photographs. You can shoot compositions that are either horizontal, they're vertical, they're dynamic, but what we're really after is how do you interpret this particular assignment. It says to shoot compositions that illustrate inherent curves. We're asking that you still pick out the best 4 images that might include inherent curves, or it might show horizontal or vertical. The subject matter is open to you, but we're looking for you to display what you learned in Lesson 3. Perhaps it's the underlying structures of an ellipse or a triangular composition. So decide what are the best images, but make sure that that descriptor, such as inherent curves, or maybe this is a horizontal composition, is included with the title of your image. And again, it's project 3, picture 3, or picture 1, picture 2, your name, and a descriptor. Have a good week.